The teaspoon was in the wrong place. That was the first thing. Not the body, not the cold, not the particular stillness that had settled over the vicarage drawing-room like a held breath that no one had yet thought to release. It was the teaspoon, small, silver, bearing the faint tarnish of a household that polished its good things on Sundays and left them to quietly oxidize the rest of the week. It lay on the saucer. Yes, but on the left side, resting at an angle that suggested it had been placed there by someone thinking about placement, rather than someone who had simply set it down after stirring. Holmes noticed it within 4 seconds of entering the room. He said nothing. The drawing-room of St. Cuthbert's Vicarage, Chadwick Fen, smelled of cold tea, chrysanthemums beginning their slow decline in a vase by the window, and beneath both of those, faintly, persistently, something mineral, something that did not belong among the doilies and the framed scripture and the particular brand of chintzy respectability that English village vicarages had been perfecting for 3 centuries. The fire had burned down to embers. No one had thought to stoke it. Outside, the frost lay absolute and glittering across the churchyard, and the light coming through the lace curtains was the flat, pale light of a December afternoon that has already quietly decided to become evening. Reverend Arthur Hollis sat in his armchair as though he had simply grown tired and closed his eyes. He was 63 years of age, a man of moderate health and immoderate routine, the sort of man, as the village constable had already noted twice in his preliminary remarks, who was in perfectly fine health just yesterday. His hands rested on the arms of the chair in a way that was almost studied. His teacup, on the side table to his right, was still half full. When was he found? Holmes asked. His voice was quiet, not gentle precisely, but calibrated. A voice doing its work without unnecessary display. Constable Briggs, who had the build of a man who had played rugby in his youth, and the expression of a man who deeply wished he were somewhere else at this particular moment, consulted his notebook. 4:30, Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Peel, that's the housekeeper, came in to collect the tea things. Thought he was asleep at first. And the tea was taken at what time? 3 o'clock, sir. Regular as the church clock, according to Mrs. Peel. Every Thursday, himself and the parish guests. Holmes made a small sound that was not quite acknowledgment and not quite dismissal, and crouched beside the armchair. Not beside the body, beside the side table. Beside the teacup and its saucer and the small, wrongly placed spoon. Watson stood near the door, as he often did in these first minutes, giving Holmes the room, and using the time to take in what his own instincts offered. He had been a doctor before he had been a chronicler of mysteries, and it was the doctor's eye that moved over Reverend Hollis now. The slight cyanosis at the lips, the relaxed quality of the hands. Nothing violent, nothing that would have, under ordinary village circumstances, suggested anything other than a heart that had decided, between one sip and the next, that it had done sufficient work. Except that Watson had come here with Holmes, and things that appeared ordinary in Holmes's vicinity had a way of proving themselves otherwise. There were other guests at the tea, Watson said to Constable Briggs. 4 of them, sir. Mrs. Alderton, churchwarden's wife, Dr. Featherstone, the village physician, Miss Hollis, the vicar's niece, who stays with him during term holidays, and... Briggs paused, in the way that people paused when they were about to introduce something they hadn't quite accounted for. A Miss Marple, From St. Mary Mead, visiting her friend Mrs. Peel for the week. From the window, without turning, a quiet voice said, "I am still here, Constable." She was small and white-haired, and dressed in the kind of sensible wool that English countrywomen wore, not because it was fashionable, but because it was honest. And she had been standing at the window for the entirety of the time that Watson had been in the room. He had, to his mild embarrassment, not registered her as a person so much as a presence, the way one doesn't register a particularly observant bookshelf. Miss Marple turned from the window. Her eyes were very blue and very steady, and they moved from the constable to Watson to Holmes, who had not looked up from the side table, with the patience of someone who had learned, over a long life in a small village, that the most important observations were made when no one thought you were observing. "You'll forgive me for remaining," she said to Holmes's back. "I find that people remember details more accurately when asked soon after. And I noticed something during the tea that I think may be of use to you." Holmes straightened. He turned. For a moment he simply looked at her, that particular quality of attention he gave to things that had surprised him, which was rare enough to be notable. "Then I am glad you stayed," he said, and meant it, Watson thought, or something close enough to mean it that the distinction hardly mattered. Outside, Chadwick Fen was doing what English villages do in the cold months. It was persisting. There is a particular quality to the persistence of small English villages in winter, a quality quite distinct from the drama of cities under frost, quite different from the romantic desolation of moorland or coast. The village persists warmly, narrowly, with curtains drawn against the dark by 4 o'clock, and the smell of wood smoke threading through every lane, and the post office still opening at 9 sharp because certain things do not yield to weather, and the understanding between neighbours that they will not mention how worried they are about old Mr. This or widowed Mrs. That, because mentioning it would make it real, and winter is long enough already. Chadwick Fen had a high street that was really more of a wide lane, a Norman church with a tower that leaned approximately 3 degrees east, and had been leaning so since the reign of George III, without anyone finding this troubling. A pub called the Wheatsheaf that smelled of old timber and new ale, a post office that doubled as a lending library on Tuesday afternoons, and several hundred souls going about the business of their lives with the brisk efficiency of people who have always known that life is a matter of managing, not transcending. The vicarage stood at the far end of the churchyard, connected to the church by a path of old flagstones that generations of frost had made irregular and slightly hazardous. It was a handsome house in the way that houses built for practical comfort rather than display often are. Solid, proportioned, with a wisteria that in summer would have made it picturesque, and in December was a network of bare, dark vines against pale stone. The garden had been put to bed for winter with some care. Someone, presumably the vicar himself, or perhaps Mrs. Peel, had tied up the rose canes against the fence with strips of cloth. One of those strips was red ribbon. It caught Watson's eye as he stepped outside for a moment, the cold air sharp and clarifying after the close atmosphere of the drawing-room. Red ribbon tied around a rose cane beside the garden gate. New ribbon, not weathered, not faded. It had not been there through the autumn, and yet there was something slightly effortful about its placement, as though it had been tied not to protect the rose, but to mark something, or to remember something, or perhaps, and here Watson's thoughts arrived at a place he could not quite justify, to be seen. He filed it away, in the way that years with Holmes had taught him to file small things away. Meaningless, perhaps, or not yet meaningful. He went back inside. Holmes had moved to the fireplace. He stood with his back to the room, looking at the mantelpiece. And what he was looking at, Watson could see it now, was the small carriage clock that sat at the mantelpiece's centre, flanked by a china shepherdess on one side and a framed photograph on the other. The clock had stopped. 3:17. The clock stopped at 17 minutes past 3, Holmes said, without being asked. Might have run down, Briggs offered. It was wound this morning. Mrs. Peel wound it. She winds it every morning without fail, she tells us. It is a 30-hour clock. It should not have stopped before evening. Holmes turned. It was stopped, deliberately, at 17 minutes past 3. The room received this information with varying degrees of comprehension. Constable Briggs wrote it down, which was the constable's method of managing things he did not yet understand. Watson understood that Holmes was building something, not yet complete, not yet ready to be seen, and that this was one of its cornerstones. Miss Marple, from her position near the window, made a small sound. Not surprise, something more like recognition. You noticed it too, Holmes said. I noticed that Mrs. Alderton looked at it, Miss Marple said carefully, at 17 minutes past 3, while the vicar was still speaking. She looked at the clock for rather longer than one, looks at a clock when one merely wants to know the time. The quality of the silence that followed was particular. It was the silence of a small room in which several people have just understood that something that appeared accidental was not accidental, and that the space between 3 o'clock and 4:30, between the tea and the finding of the body, had been arranged, rather than simply elapsed. Watson looked at the teacup. Still half full. Cold now, certainly. He thought about what might be at the bottom of it, beneath the dregs of ordinary tea on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, and felt the familiar sombre weight of a case that wore an ordinary face. The teaspoon, he said, quietly. Holmes turned to him. It's on the left side of the saucer, Watson said. He was right-handed. Yes, said Holmes. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who was pleased, not happily, but in the deep, precise way of someone who has found the first thread of something and knows, already, that it will lead somewhere true. Yes, it is. He did not explain further. Not yet. The explanation was there, waiting, in the same way that the answers to things always wait, patient and complete and entirely unhurried, for the moment when all the other pieces have arrived to receive them. Outside, the frost deepened. The last light left the churchyard in degrees, and the church tower cast its slightly tilted shadow across the graves in the long, blue way of winter dusk. Somewhere down the lane the Wheatsheaf had opened its doors, and the smell of wood smoke and the sound of low voices drifted through the cold air with the particular comfort of a world continuing despite everything. Watson stood at the vicarage gate for a moment before following Holmes to their lodgings at the inn. The red ribbon was still there, tied around the rose cane. In the last of the fading light, it was simply dark. You could not have said it was red at all. Only someone who had seen it on daylight would know. He untied it, carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He did not know why, precisely. He knew only that Holmes had taught him, over many years, that the small things were never small, that the world arranged its evidence not in the grand gestures that people expected, but in the quiet ones they did not. The frost crunched under his boots as he walked. The church clock, the real one, in the tower, began to strike 5. Each note fell into the cold air and disappeared, soft and clear and final, like something being counted and gently let go. The Wheatsheaf Inn had 6 rooms, 4 of which were habitable in winter, and of those 4, 2 had been prepared for Holmes and Watson with the particular brand of efficiency that small English villages reserve for unexpected but important visitors. The beds were made with clean linen that smelled of lavender and cold air. The washstands held fresh water that was already beginning to lose its warmth to the December chill. On each windowsill, someone, presumably the innkeeper's wife, a brisk and capable woman named Mrs. Holt, who had already assessed both men with the thoroughness of a customs official, had placed a small sprig of holly in a glass of water. Festive and practical and faintly supervisory. Holmes had taken one look at his room, declared it adequate, and immediately moved to the small sitting room at the end of the corridor that Mrs. Holt had offered for their use. It held a round table, 4 chairs, a fire that someone had already lit, and a window that looked out across the high street toward the church. Holmes had placed himself in the chair with the best view of both the fire and the window, and was sitting with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin when Watson arrived, still unwinding his scarf. "Sit down, Watson. Mrs. Holt is bringing tea." "More tea," Watson said, with the mild irony of a man who spent an afternoon in a house where tea has recently become a rather loaded subject. "Quite?" Holmes almost smiled. "We will try not to find anything suspicious in it." The tea arrived, strong, hot, accompanied by a plate of shortbread that Watson ate 3 pieces of before remembering that he had intended to show restraint, and with it came the quiet settling that always followed the first hours of a case. The urgency of observation gave way to the slower work of arrangement. Holmes stared at the fire. Watson took out his notebook and wrote down, in his careful physician's hand, everything he had seen in the vicarage drawing-room. The teaspoon. The clock stopped at 3:17. The half-full teacup. The arrangement of the chair. The red ribbon outside, which he mentioned to Holmes now, producing it from his coat pocket and laying it on the table between them. Holmes looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Where exactly? Garden gate, tied around the rose cane on the right-hand post. New ribbon, not weathered. Hadn't been there long. Which side of the gate? Watson paused, thought. The inside, the garden side. Holmes picked up the ribbon then, held it briefly between 2 fingers, and set it down again. It was tied from inside the garden, someone who'd come through the gate, or who had been standing inside it. He looked up. Or someone who wished to mark that they had been there, at a particular time, without being obvious about it. A signal? Possibly. Possibly simply a habit, or a token, or something I'm currently overstating. Holmes leaned back. We will see. The village of Chadwick Fen, like all villages of its kind, ran on 2 things, routine and information. The routine was visible, the post office opening, the church bell marking the hours, Mrs. Alderton's Monday flower arranging, the vicar's Thursday teas, the Wednesday cattle market in the next town that brought farmers through the high street, with the smell of the fields clinging to their coats. The information was less visible, but no less structured. It moved through the village in the way that water moves through good soil, quietly, thoroughly, leaving everything subtly changed. The primary conduit of this information was not, as outsiders might assume, the pub, though the Wheatsheaf did its part. It was, in fact, the network of doorstep conversations, parish meetings, lending library exchanges, and what the village privately called a word after church. That particular institution wherein anything that could not be said openly was conveyed with remarkable precision in the 12 steps between the church door and the lich gate, under the guise of commenting on the weather. Miss Marple, Watson was beginning to understand, was fluent in all of it. She arrived at the Wheatsheaf at 7:30, having been invited by Holmes, an invitation that Watson suspected had been less social and more strategic, which amounted, where Holmes was concerned, to much the same thing. She came in from the cold, with pink cheeks and bright eyes, and the air of someone who had spent the intervening hours productively, and she accepted a chair by the fire and a cup of tea with the ease of a woman entirely comfortable with the fact that she knew more than she had yet said. "I've spoken with Mrs. Peel," she began, without preamble, settling her knitting, which she had brought, as Watson would come to understand she always brought it, like a portable piece of domestic continuity, onto her lap. "And with Mrs. Thorne at the post office, who sees everything that passes through this village, whether or not it was addressed to her. And I paid a brief call on Mrs. Alderton." Holmes, who had been looking at the fire, turned to look at Miss Marple instead. And the Thursday tea," Miss Marple said, her needles beginning their quiet, rhythmic work, "was not, as one might assume, a simple act of parish hospitality. It was a ritual. Reverend Hollis had held it every Thursday for 11 years. The guest list had been essentially unchanged for the last 4. Mrs. Alderton, Dr. Featherstone, Miss Hollis, and, until last spring, a Mr. Gerald Oakes, the churchwarden himself, who died in April. Alderton's husband, Watson said. Her late husband, yes. He was replaced on the guest list, quietly, without fuss, as these things are managed in villages, by his wife. Which, Miss Marple added, with the careful neutrality of someone making an observation rather than a judgment. Some people thought entirely natural, and others thought rather pointed. "Pointed how?" Watson asked. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed. "Mr. Oakes and Reverend Hollis had a disagreement, some years ago, about the parish accounts. It was never spoken of openly. That is not how these things are managed here. But it settled between them, like furniture that has been moved and leaves marks on the carpet. After Mr. Oakes died, one might have expected the matter to simply conclude." She looked up. Instead, Mrs. Alderton began attending the Thursday tea, and the Reverend, by all accounts, was not entirely comfortable with her presence, though he was too well-mannered to show it. The fire crackled. Outside, the frost-hardened high street was empty now, the shops dark, a single gas lamp casting its small, determined circle of yellow light in front of the post office. Watson found himself thinking about what it must be like to have a grievance in a village this size, how there was nowhere to put it, nowhere to take it, nowhere to let it disperse into the anonymity that cities generously provided. Here, a disagreement sat down at your Thursday tea. Here, the person whose face reminded you of everything unresolved lived 4 doors away and sang in the same choir and required you, every Sunday, to pass the peace. The parish accounts, Holmes said. He said it in the particular quiet way that meant he had already arrived somewhere and was waiting for the conversation to catch up. There was a ledger in the vicar's study. I noticed it, the accounts book for the last financial year, with a gap on the September page, something erased, not crossed out. Erased, and the page slightly rippled from moisture, the way paper ripples when something wet has been applied, and then dried. Miss Marple nodded, once, as though this confirmed something she had half expected. Mrs. Thorne mentioned, and she mentioned it, in the way that suggests she had been waiting for an opportunity to mention it for some time, that there was a question, last autumn, about the fund for the church roof restoration, a donation that was recorded in the public minutes of the parish council, but which did not appear to have arrived in the account in the expected amount. How large a donation? Watson asked. £40, Miss Marple said. It was not a vast sum. It was not nothing. In a village this size, in a year when the harvest had been modest and the winters had arrived early, for the 3rd consecutive year, £40 was the difference between managing and struggling for a number of households. It was the kind of sum that, misplaced, could generate precisely the kind of low, persistent, unresolvable resentment that a village excelled at nurturing, the kind that attended Thursday teas and looked at clocks. Holmes rose at this point and went to the window. It was a habit of his, at moments when he was thinking hard, the need to look at something external, as though the outside world served as a kind of counterweight to the interior density of his own reasoning. The High Street offered him frost and lamplight, and, at the far end, the dark shape of the church against a sky that had gone the particular deep blue of a clear winter night, scattered with stars that seemed, in the cold, to burn more sharply than usual. "Tell me about the others," he said, without turning. "Dr. Featherstone. Village physician for 20 years, Miss Marple said. Competent and well regarded, though Mrs. Peel says he has become rather more fond of his own opinions in the last 5 years, as men of a certain age sometimes do. He was the one who was called when the Reverend was found, and he was the one who was prepared, very promptly, I thought, to suggest natural causes." He signed the death certificate. He had begun to, yes. The constable stopped him when word reached the county that you were coming, Mr. Holmes. Holmes turned from the window. There was something in his expression that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite concern, a kind of careful attention, like a man reading a text that is asking him to consider 2 things at once. "And Miss Hollis? The niece?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Her knitting slowed. "Clara Hollis is 26, she said at last. She teaches at a school in Oxford during term time, and she visits her uncle for the holidays. She is a nervous girl, not naturally so, I think, but made so by something. She was very distressed this afternoon, which is entirely natural. And yet," she paused, "she was distressed in the particular way of someone who was expecting something to happen, and cannot quite believe that it has." "Guilt?" Watson offered. "I never assume guilt from distress," Miss Marple said, with gentle firmness. In my experience, the guilty ones are rarely the distressed ones. The distressed ones are usually people who knew something was wrong and did not know what to do about it, or people who feel responsible without being culpable, or simply, and one must always allow for this, people who are genuinely grieving. She looked at Watson with the steadiness of someone who had spent a long life watching people, in the precise moments when they were most truly themselves. Grief and guilt can wear very similar clothes. One must be careful not to mistake the wardrobe for the occupant. Watson wrote that down. He was not entirely sure why, except that it seemed like something worth keeping. The evening deepened around them. Mrs. Holt appeared at the door at 9 o'clock to inquire about whether the gentleman and their guest required anything further, and departed with the shortbread plate and the quietly satisfied expression of a woman who has eavesdropped on approximately 4 minutes of a conversation she found extremely interesting and intends to process thoroughly later. The fire had burned to a comfortable depth of heat. Miss Marple's knitting had advanced by several inches. Watson had filled 3 pages of his notebook. Holmes had said very little for the last 20 minutes. He was in the particular state of stillness that Watson recognized, not absence, but the opposite of absence, an interior presence so complete that the exterior went quiet to accommodate it. On the table between them sat the red ribbon. Beside it, Watson had placed his notes, and, in the middle of his notes, circled twice, were the words he had written without fully understanding why. Teaspoon, left side, wrong. She poured for him, Holmes said suddenly. Both Watson and Miss Marple looked at him. Someone poured the vicar's tea for him, or sweetened it, or stirred it, and placed the spoon on the left side of the saucer because they are left-handed, and did so without thinking, and the thinking didn't arrive until afterward. He looked at the fire. The stopped clock tells us the time it was done. The teaspoon tells us the hand that did it. The room held this. Outside, the church clock struck 10, each note dropping into the cold with the quiet authority of something that had been keeping time in this village for longer than anyone present had been alive, and would continue to do so long after the present difficulty was resolved. Miss Marple folded her knitting and placed it in her bag. "I think," she said, rising with the unhurried dignity of a woman who has sat through many difficult evenings and found them all eventually navigable, "that tomorrow I will call on Clara Hollis. She needs someone to talk to, I suspect, and people say a great deal to someone who appears to be merely listening." She said good night and left. Watson listened to her quiet footsteps on the stair. Then he looked at Holmes, who was still looking at the fire, with the expression of a man turning a thought over and over, feeling for its edges. "Who is left-handed?" Watson asked, of the 4 guests. Holmes picked up the red ribbon from the table, turned it once between his fingers, set it down. "That," he said, "is what tomorrow is for." The fire settled. The lamp burned low. Somewhere outside, in the deep and patient frost, Chadwick Fenn slept, or appeared to sleep, which in a village was often the same thing, and occasionally, as the present circumstances suggested, was not. Holmes was gone before dawn. Watson discovered this in the particular way one discovers things at country inns in winter, by waking to a silence that felt inhabited until it didn't, and finding, upon investigation, that the chair by the sitting-room fire held only a cold cup of tea and a folded note that read, in Holmes's precise hand, walking, back by 8. Don't wait for breakfast, do wait for the ledger. Watson waited for breakfast. Mrs. Holt provided it with the thoroughness of a woman who considered adequate feeding a moral position. Eggs, toast, a rasher of bacon, a pot of tea that was genuinely hot, and a small pot of marmalade that Watson suspected she had made herself, and was, on the quiet evidence of its flavour, rather proud of. He ate alone in the sitting-room, watching the high street come to life through the frost-laced window. The post office opening at 9 sharp as promised, a farmer's cart moving through with a load of winter root vegetables, 2 women in good wool coats exchanging words on the pavement, with the focused energy of people conveying something important under the guise of discussing something ordinary. Chadwick Fen woke slowly, and then all at once, in the way of small places, where everyone's morning is loosely synchronized by proximity and habit. The church clock struck 8. A dog barked twice, then stopped, apparently satisfied. The smell of wood smoke thickened pleasantly in the cold air, and Watson, halfway through his second cup of tea, felt the particular quality of a winter morning in the English countryside settle over him. Not quite peace, because there was a dead vicar and an unanswered question, but something adjacent to it. A kind of suspended calm, like the moment between one breath and the next. Holmes arrived at 8 minutes past 8, with frost on his coat and the expression of a man who has been productive. He sat down, accepted the tea Watson poured for him, and did not drink it. He placed both hands flat on the table and looked at the middle distance in the way that meant he was not looking at anything in the room but at something assembled inside his own mind, turning it slowly, checking its architecture. "The vicarage garden," he said, at last. "The layout. The gate through which we entered is the public gate, faces the churchyard path. There is a second gate at the far end of the garden, in the wall that borders the lane behind the properties. A tradesman's access, technically. Old latch. Used regularly. The mud on both sides of it is disturbed recently, and the latch itself has been oiled within the last week or so. Someone has been coming and going that way with enough frequency to bother oiling it. Or someone oiled it recently in preparation for one particular use," Watson said. Holmes looked at him with a flicker of approval. "Precisely. The garden side of that gate, the inside, has a rose cane on the right-hand post, from which, as of yesterday, the red ribbon has been removed." He picked up the ribbon from the table, where Watson had left it. This ribbon was a marker, not a signal to another person, I think. A personal marker. Someone noting a time or a route or confirming an action completed. A reminder to themselves. Or a small ritual of intent. People do such things, particularly people who are managing something alone, without confederates, who have no one to confirm the plan with, and so confirm it to themselves instead. He finally drank his tea. The oiled gate, the marker ribbon, the stopped clock. 3 things that suggest preparation. 3 things that a casual observer, a grief-struck household, a willing village doctor would never have assembled into a pattern. Watson looked out at the high street, where the morning was now fully underway. A woman with a basket, a boy on a bicycle, moving with great optimism and insufficient caution over the frost-slicked cobbles, the post office receiving its first customer of the day. "You think the death was planned well in advance?" "I think it was. Planned with the patience of someone who knew the routine exactly, who had access to the space, and who understood that the most useful thing about a small village is that its ordinariness is taken for granted. Holmes set down the cup. A grand crime in London attracts scrutiny by its very scale. Here, a man dies in his armchair at tea time, and the village physician is ready to call it natural causes before anyone has thought to ask a single question. The smallness is the strategy. He went to the vicarage at 9:30. Constable Briggs had arranged that Holmes might have access to the study, and the study yielded the ledger, a large cloth-bound accounts book in the practical, undecorated style of parish administration, its pages ruled in blue and filled with the Reverend's careful hand. 11 years of Thursday teas and church roof funds and harvest suppers and the annual Christmas charity collection, all recorded with the conscientious precision of a man who considered good accounting a form of honesty. The September page was the one. Holmes had found the rippling yesterday, the slight buckling of paper that indicated moisture, applied and dried, which was what happened when someone used a damp cloth, or perhaps a damp finger, to erase something written in ordinary pencil. The erased entry was on the 14th of September, a Thursday, Holmes noted, and though the words themselves were gone, the pressure of the pencil had left the faintest of impressions in the paper beneath. Holmes held the page at an angle to the cold light from the study window, turning it slowly. The impression read, R.H., £40, received and noted, pending account. R.H. Watson, arriving quietly at the study door, looked over Holmes's shoulder. R.H., he said. The vicar's initials, Reverend Hollis. Or a donor with those initials. But given the context, given what Miss Marple told us about the missing £40 from the roof restoration fund, I think this is a record of the vicar receiving a private payment, or acknowledging one. Something that was later considered unwise to have written down, and so was removed. Holmes set the ledger down and looked around the study with the comprehensive attention he gave to rooms that had belonged to the dead, not morbid, not invasive, but with a quality of respect for what a room could tell about its occupant, when the occupant was no longer present to manage the impression. The study was a modest, well-used room. Books along 2 walls, theology, history, a shelf of novels that the vicar had presumably not considered it necessary to display in a more public area, including 3 detective stories that made Holmes's mouth twitch very slightly, a desk with a leather surface, worn soft by years, a small photograph in a silver frame, a younger Hollis with a woman who bore a slight resemblance to Clara, which suggested the vicar's late sister, Clara's mother. And on the desk, beneath a glass paperweight, a letter. The envelope had been opened and resealed. Holmes lifted the paperweight and held the envelope to the light. The seal, a plain wax seal in dark red, was cracked along one edge, not at the flap. Someone had opened it, not by breaking the seal cleanly, but by applying gentle heat to soften the wax, lifting the flap, and then pressing the wax back into approximate position. It had adhered, mostly. The crack was narrow. It would not have been noticed by someone not looking for it. Holmes opened the letter properly. It was dated the 3rd of November, and it was from Clara Hollis. Watson read it over Holmes's shoulder, conscious of the slight discomfort of reading a dead man's private correspondence, and conscious simultaneously that the discomfort was necessary. The letter was brief. It said, in the straightforward language of a young woman who had been raised to write clearly and mean what she said. Dear Uncle, I think you should know that I have seen the accounts. I don't know what the right thing to do is, and I am frightened of making it worse. But I could not say nothing. I will come at Christmas as planned. Perhaps we can speak of it then. With love, Clara. The date was the 3rd of November. The vicar had died on the 11th of December. Holmes refolded the letter and replaced it beneath the paperweight with the same precise care with which he had found it. He stood for a moment looking at the desk, at the cracked seal, at the photograph of the vicar and his sister, at the small ordinary objects of a life that had ended between one Thursday and the next. She knew, Watson said quietly. She suspected, which may have been enough for someone watching the household closely to constitute a risk. Holmes's voice was level and even, but Watson had known him long enough to hear what was underneath it, not coldness, but the particular contained weight of a man who finds a pattern elegant and deplorable in equal measure. Someone opened that letter before the vicar read it, resealed it, and understood that time, which had been a luxury, had become a constraint. They walked back through the churchyard. The frost had softened slightly as the morning advanced, and the churchyard had acquired the particular quality of an English winter garden at mid-morning, not quite beautiful, not quite bleak, but holding both possibilities with the equanimity of old stone. The yew trees that flanked the path were very dark and very still. The graves, many of them old enough that the inscriptions had become suggestions rather than statements, stood in their rows with the democratic patience of things that have outlasted urgency. Watson found himself reading the names as he walked. Families that had occupied this village for generations, the same surnames reappearing across decades. Parents and children and grandchildren gathered into the same few feet of Chadwick Fen earth. It was at once melancholy and oddly comforting, that continuity, the sense that a place could hold people even after they had finished needing it too. Holmes walked without looking at the graves. He was, Watson understood, still inside the study in his mind, turning the letter, the ledger, the cracked seal, assembling them into the architecture of motive, with the methodical care of a man who knew that the structure had to be sound before he could invite anyone else inside it. At the lich gate, they paused. "The £40, Watson said. You think the vicar took it?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. "I think the vicar recorded a private receipt of £40 and then erased the record. I think the simplest explanation is that the money moved from the church account into his personal one, and that Gerald Oakes, who was churchwarden and therefore in a position to notice, did notice, and that the disagreement between them, which the village euphemistically described as a difference of opinion about parish administration, was, in fact, precisely about this." He paused. "Oakes died in April. Whatever leverage or threat he represented died with him, and the vicar may have believed the matter concluded. Then Clara's letter arrived, and then—" He stopped. Watson followed his gaze across the churchyard to the vicarage gate, where a figure was standing in the garden. Miss Marple, apparently examining the rose canes along the fence, with the placid interest of a woman who simply enjoys horticulture and has no ulterior purpose whatsoever. She looked up as they approached. Her eyes went briefly to Holmes's coat pocket, where Watson knew the cracked seal letter now rested in a folded square of paper. "I've been with Clara," she said. "She's in a better state this morning. Not well, but clearer. She told me about the letter she wrote to her uncle." "We found it," Holmes said. "Opened and resealed." Miss Marple nodded. She said she'd been uncertain whether to send it at all. She found the discrepancy in the accounts during her last visit in October, when her uncle asked her to help him sort some papers. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough to be troubled. She looked at the rose canes, then back at Holmes. She also told me something else. She said that when she arrived 2 days ago, the day before the Thursday tea, she found Mrs. Alderton in the hall. In the vicarage hall. Mrs. Peel had let her in, apparently, to leave a contribution for the Christmas charity collection. Clara thought nothing of it at the time, but she mentioned that Mrs. Alderton seemed, her word was, bustling, moving through the hall with a purpose that seemed slightly in excess of what the errand required. The garden was quiet around them. The bare rose canes cast thin, intricate shadows on the frost-pale ground. Watson thought about a woman moving through a hall with a purpose that slightly exceeded her errand, and about a teaspoon placed on the wrong side of a saucer, and about a clock stopped at 3:17 by a hand that had looked at it while a man was still speaking. "Left-handed," he said suddenly. "Mrs. Alderton." Miss Marple looked at him with the approving expression of a teacher whose student has arrived at the correct answer by the right method. "She writes with her left hand," she said. "I noticed it yesterday, when she signed the condolence card that was being passed around the village, and she pours tea from the left. I observed it at the Thursday gathering before the Reverend fell ill. It is a small thing. People rarely notice how someone pours." Holmes said nothing. He was looking at the garden gate, the inside latch, the oiled mechanism, the post where the red ribbon had been and was no longer. His expression was the one Watson associated with the moment when a scattered set of elements ceases to be a collection and becomes a structure, when the bones of a thing reveal themselves beneath the surface. "She came through the garden gate the day before," Holmes said, slowly. "Not the public gate, the tradesman's gate, the one she had taken the trouble to oil. She came through it and into the vicarage, not to leave a charity contribution, or not only to leave a charity contribution. And she was in the hall long enough for her errand to have a second purpose." "The study is off the hall," Watson said. "The study," Holmes said, "is off the hall." The church clock struck 11. Its voice moved across the frost and the graves and the bare winter garden with the unhurried authority of something that had been marking time in this village through matters far more and far less significant than the present one, so that would continue to do so, reliably, long after the present question had been resolved. Holmes turned from the gate. "I need to look at the study again," he said. "Specifically the desk drawer. Specifically whether anything was placed there that should not be there, or removed that should not have been removed in the 12 hours before the Thursday tea." He walked back toward the vicarage. Watson followed. Behind them, Miss Marple remained for a moment at the garden gate, looking at the rose cane where the ribbon had been. The small, bare thing of it, the mark of an intent that had been carried out, and the absence that was left behind when it was done. Then she followed them inside, her footsteps quiet and even on the frost-stiffened path, her knitting bag over her arm, her expression the particular settled calm of a woman who has understood something and is waiting, with patience, for the right moment to say it aloud. The study desk had 3 drawers. Holmes opened each one with the care of a man who understands that the most important thing about a drawer is not what it contains, but what it reveals about the person who last touched it. The top drawer held the ordinary administration of a clergyman's life, correspondence, a bottle of ink, 2 spare nibs, a roll of stamps, and a small notebook of sermon notes written in the Reverend's careful hand. The middle drawer held personal items, a folded handkerchief, a worn prayer book with a ribbon marker at the 23rd Psalm, a small tin of throat lozenges. The bottom drawer held parish documents, neatly tied in bundles with brown string, each bundle labelled in the same careful hand. Holmes crouched before the bottom drawer for a long moment, not touching anything, simply looking. Then he reached in and lifted out the bundle labelled Roof Restoration Fund, Correspondence and Accounts, 1934. He untied it on the desk. Watson stood at his shoulder. Miss Marple had taken the chair by the window. The same chair, Watson realised, that she had occupied during the Thursday tea, the chair from which she had watched everything and from which the mantelpiece clock was directly visible. The bundle contained 12 letters, 3 receipts, 2 estimates from builders, and a single folded sheet that was not a letter, and not a receipt, but a private accounting, handwritten, unsigned, in a hand that was not the Reverend's. The figures on it corresponded to the parish account, with one addition. A column of outgoings on the right side, each one small, each one dated. The total at the bottom, arriving at £40 exactly. Holmes read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at the window. Someone was documenting the withdrawals, Watson said. Someone was building a record, Holmes said. Not for public use. There are no names on it, no formal headings. This was kept for private purposes, as insurance, perhaps, or as the evidence supporting a demand. He looked at the unsigned accounting sheet with the detached attention of a man examining a mechanism. Gerald Oakes kept this. When he died in April, it should have disappeared, either discarded by his family or simply lost among his effects. Instead, it is here, in the vicar's study, in the roof, fund bundle, where it was presumably placed by someone who found it among Oakes's papers and chose to give it to the vicar rather than destroy it. Or chose to give it to the vicar as a warning, Watson said, as a way of saying, I know what Oakes knew. Holmes looked at him. Yes. The room was very quiet. Outside, the frost had finally begun to yield to the thin winter sunlight, and the churchyard beyond the study window had acquired a faint, fragile brightness, the kind that English winter managed occasionally, briefly, as though reminding itself what warmth had once felt like. It was Watson who returned to the teaspoon. Holmes had moved on, in the way he moved on from objects once they had given him what he needed, completely, without sentiment, his attention already somewhere further along the chain. But Watson, who was a doctor and therefore accustomed to the precise language of physical evidence, found himself returning in his mind to the small silver thing in its wrong position, with its faint residue and its carefully angled placement. He asked Constable Briggs to bring it from where it had been secured. Briggs produced it in a small envelope, and Watson carried it to the window and held it in the pale winter light, with the focus he had once given to specimens in a hospital laboratory. The residue was on the inside of the bowl, not tea-staining, which was brown and dull, and the colour of years, but something else. Faint. Almost not there. a slight crystalline quality to the faint mark, as though something that had been dissolved had left the ghost of itself behind when the liquid dried. "What do you know of aconitine?" Holmes asked from across the room without looking up from the accounting sheet. Watson set the teaspoon down carefully. "Monkshood derivative, extraordinarily potent, effective in very small quantities. It presents as cardiac failure in sufficient dose, and in a man of 63, with no previous history of heart trouble. The presentation would be," he paused, "convincing, if the attending physician was prepared to find natural causes. And if the attending physician had been the vicar's doctor for 20 years, and therefore had both the standing to certify the death and the established knowledge of the patient's health history to make the certification plausible." Holmes set down the accounting sheet. "Featherstone, I am not yet suggesting his involvement was active. It may have been merely convenient, a physician who trusted his own prior knowledge too readily, and who did not look for what he was not expecting to find." "Aconitine in the tea," Watson said, "in this cup specifically, not the general pot." "In the spoon," Holmes said. "The poison was introduced via the spoon, applied to the bowl of it before the tea was poured, so that when it was used to stir, the residue dissolved directly into the cup. A small quantity. Enough, in an elderly man, to induce cardiac arrest within 40 minutes." He paused, "which places the act of poisoning not at the pouring of the tea, but at the moment when someone took the vicar's spoon, applied something to it, and replaced it, or placed it fresh at his setting, before he sat down." Watson thought about Clara arriving the day before the tea, and finding Mrs. Alderton in the hall, moving through it with a purpose slightly in excess of her errand. "She went into the drawing-room," he said, "not only the hall. The drawing-room where the tea-things were already laid. Mrs. Peel sets the table the afternoon before, every Wednesday evening, for the Thursday tea. She told us so. The cups, the saucers, the spoons, the plates, everything set and ready." Holmes looked at the teaspoon. All that was required was a moment alone with one specific place setting, 30 seconds, perhaps less. The clarity of it was, Watson thought, both impressive and deeply melancholy. Not a dramatic act, not something requiring strength, or courage of the violent kind, or the confrontation of one person with another. A 30-second act of arrangement the previous afternoon, in an empty drawing-room, with the tea-things already laid and the house going about its business around the edges of one person's steady, patient, private purpose. Watson took the train to the next market town that afternoon. Holmes had asked him to visit the lending library there, larger than Chadwick Fenn's Tuesday arrangement, and holding, Holmes had reason to believe, a set of pharmaceutical and botanical reference texts that would confirm what they already suspected about the residue on the spoon. Watson went willingly. He found the library in a narrow building between a solicitor's office and a saddler, tended by a young woman of approximately 20, who wore her hair in a practical braid and received Watson's request for botanical toxicology references with the unflappable efficiency of someone who had been asked for stranger things. She produced 3 texts. Watson sat at the library's single reading table, beneath a window that looked out on a market square, where a few late afternoon stalls were packing up in the cold, and he read for an hour and a half. Aconitine, derived from Aconitum napellus, monkshood, wolfsbane, the plant that grew in English cottage gardens with such cheerful disregard for its own lethality. It had been used as a poison since antiquity, well documented, well known among anyone who had read broadly in botany or medicine, or, for that matter, the history of crime. A winter garden might easily contain it. A person with some botanical knowledge, or simply with the curiosity to look it up, would know that the alkaloid could be extracted, concentrated, crystallized in small quantities. That in a small dose, introduced via a stirring spoon into a single cup, it would act upon the heart with a quietness that a tired village physician might easily misread. Watson wrote his notes in the margin of his notebook. He wrote neatly, as he always did, and he was conscious, as he wrote, of the strange double nature of this kind of evidence, how it was both damning and sad, how it spoke simultaneously of terrible intent and of the particular human capacity for patience in pursuit of a grievance. Someone had learned this, had planned this, had stood in an English cottage garden at some point in the autumn, looking at a plant they intended to use, and had made a decision that seemed, to them, at that moment, like resolution. What had the vicar done to arrive at this? Taken £40 from a fund that trusted him, erased a record, read a letter that told him he was not as safe as he had believed, and done nothing, because the village closed around its secrets the way the frost closed around its gardens, and sometimes that felt like sufficient protection. It had not been. He returned to the wheatsheaf as the early dark was coming down, and found Holmes at the sitting-room table, with 3 things in front of him: the red ribbon, the accounting sheet from the bottom drawer, and a small piece of paper on which he had written 4 names in a column. Beside each name was a single notation: Mrs. Alderton, left-handed, access, motive, knowledge of routine; Dr. Featherstone, certification, established trust, possible awareness; Clara Hollis, knowledge of accounts, letter, fear, no access day prior; Miss Hollis, née Oakes. Holmes had written this beside Mrs. Alderton's name with a small arrow, a notation Watson did not immediately understand, and then did. Alderton, Watson said. Her maiden name was Oakes. Her husband's name was Oakes, Holmes said. Gerald Oakes, the churchwarden. Mrs. Alderton was his wife. Watson sat down. You said Alderton. She remarried, briefly, between 18 months and now, a widower from the next village, a Mr. Alderton, who died in September. She is twice widowed, and currently using the name of her second husband. Holmes looked at the ribbon, which is why it took slightly longer than it should have to establish that the woman sitting at the Thursday tea, in the chair her first husband had occupied, watching the clock at 3:17, was Gerald Oakes's widow. The fire settled. Watson poured himself tea from the pot that had gone slightly cool, and drank it anyway. She married someone else between April and September, he said slowly. Between Oakes dying and Alderton dying. And now she's here, attending the vicar's Thursday tea, under a different name. Under a name that made her, to a stranger, simply a churchwarden's widow, a parishioner, a familiar village face. Holmes folded the accounting sheet with care. She was not a stranger to the vicar, of course. He knew precisely who she was, which is why he was not comfortable with her presence at his Thursday teas, and why he continued to invite her anyway, because refusing her would have been an acknowledgment of the thing neither of them was willing to acknowledge openly. Outside the window, Chadwick Fen had gone fully dark. The lamp in front of the post office burned its patient yellow. The church clock prepared to strike 6, its mechanism gathering itself in the way that old, reliable things gather themselves before doing what they have always done. Watson looked at the teaspoon in its envelope on the corner of the table. The small silver thing, with its trace of something crystalline, its wrong-sided placement, its 30 seconds of quiet purpose the previous Wednesday afternoon. "Tomorrow," Holmes said, "I need to speak with Mrs. Alderton." He picked up the ribbon, turned it once, set it down. "And I think," he added, without looking up, "that Miss Marple should be there." Clara Hollis unravelled before noon. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about Clara, Watson had come to understand. She was a young woman built for steadiness, for the patient work of teaching and managing and getting through. And what unravelled in her was not composure, but containment. The thing she had been holding since she arrived 2 days ago, the thing she had written to her uncle about in November and had not been able to speak of to anyone since, came loose in the small parlour of the vicarage, where Miss Marple sat with her, quietly, knitting, saying very little, and thereby making it easier to say everything. Watson was not present for this. Miss Marple reported it to him afterward with the careful precision of a woman who understood the difference between what was said and what was meant, and between what was confessed and what was evidence. Clara had known about the accounts since October. She had found the discrepancy herself, not through any investigative intent, but simply because she was organized, and her uncle had asked her to help sort the study papers, and numbers, once seen, did not unsee themselves. She had written the letter. She had not known that anyone else had read it before her. Uncle did. She had not known about the cracked seal or the resealed envelope, had not understood that the letter she sent as a private concern had been read by someone who would understand its implications more coldly than she had intended them. What she told Miss Marple, haltingly, in the small parlour, was this. She had seen Mrs. Alderton in the hall on Wednesday afternoon. Yes. And she had thought nothing of it. But she had also, later that evening, gone into the drawing-room to find a book she had left there, and she had noticed, though she had not registered it as significant, that one of the teaspoons at the settings was slightly out of place. She had straightened it without thinking. Then she had gone to bed. She had straightened it. Watson stared at Miss Marple when she told him this. "She moved the teaspoon back," he said. "To the right side of the saucer," Miss Marple said. "Yes. So when Holmes observed it on the left side the following afternoon, it had been moved twice. Once by Mrs. Alderton placing it after the act, and once by Clara straightening it without knowing what she was straightening, and then," she paused, "once more, apparently, by someone who noticed Clara's correction and reversed it." Mrs. Alderton returned to the drawing-room. She had the whole of Thursday morning while the household was occupied. Mrs. Peel in the kitchen, Clara at the church helping with the Advent flowers, the vicar in his study. A house briefly empty of observers. Miss Marple folded her knitting. She is thorough. One must grant her that. The afternoon went sideways, in the way that investigations occasionally did, not through failure, but through the arrival of something superficially convincing that demanded to be properly eliminated before the real work could continue. It was Constable Briggs who brought it, with the expression of a man who has found something significant, and is cautiously proud of himself. He had been speaking with the village pharmacist, a quiet, bespectacled man named Mr. Croft, and Mr. Croft had mentioned, after some gentle prompting, that Miss Clara Hollis had come into the pharmacy 3 weeks ago and asked about monkshood. The constable delivered this information to Holmes with the air of a man laying a trump card. Holmes received it without expression. What precisely did she ask? Asked if it was dangerous, whether it grew commonly in English gardens, what it looked like in winter when it wasn't flowering. Briggs consulted his notes. Croft said she had a notebook with her. Watson looked at Holmes. Holmes looked at the fire. Clara had a motive, the accounts, the uncle who had taken money that wasn't his, the letter that had gone unanswered. She had been in the drawing room the night before the tea. She was nervous, demonstrably so, in the specific way Miss Marple had noted, the way of someone expecting something. She had asked about monkshood. It was, Watson thought, almost too neat, like a sentence that had been composed rather than spoken. She teaches natural sciences, Holmes said at last, at a school in Oxford. Briggs blinked. Sir, Clara Hollis teaches natural sciences. Asking a pharmacist about a common garden plant is precisely what a natural sciences teacher might do when preparing a lesson on botanical toxicology, or when writing curriculum materials, or when simply curious, as people whose profession involves teaching the natural world tend to be curious. Holmes rose from his chair. It is also, I will allow, what someone planning to poison a relative might do. The question is not whether she asked. The question is whether there is anything else, anything material, physical, traceable, that places her in the chain of events rather than adjacent to it. There was not. Watson was fairly certain there was not, and Miss Marple, when consulted, was serenely certain. Clara was frightened, Miss Marple said simply. She was frightened before. Her uncle died, and she has been more frightened since. That is not the emotional signature of guilt, Mr. Holmes. That is the emotional signature of someone who suspected something was wrong, could not name it, and has now found out that she was right to be afraid. She looked at Holmes steadily. The guilty ones, in my experience, are not frightened. They are watchful. There is a considerable difference. Holmes looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, with the brevity of a man conceding a point he has already half conceded to himself. Then we proceed, he said, to Mrs. Alderton. Outside, the frost was returning with the early dark, laying itself across Chadwick Fen with the patient thoroughness of something that had done this many times before, and would do it many times again, indifferent to the small human drama unfolding in the inn's sitting-room, the ribbon on the table, the names on the paper, the quiet, inevitable convergence of small things toward a single, unhurried truth. Mrs. Alderton lived in a stone cottage at the quieter end of Chadwick Fen's High Street, where the lane narrowed slightly and the houses sat closer to the road, their front gardens small and tidy and winter bare. Her cottage was the neatest of them, the path swept clear of frost, the window boxes holding the dry ghosts of summer geraniums, with a precision that suggested they had been dead-headed and arranged even in their dormancy, the door-knocker polished to a brightness that was faintly excessive for a recently widowed woman living alone. Holmes observed all of this from the gate without comment. Watson stood beside him in the thin morning cold. Behind them both, at a slight distance that was either tact or strategy, and was probably both, Miss Marple waited with her knitting bag over her arm and the expression of someone who has attended many difficult conversations and knows that the most useful thing she can do in the moments before one is to appear entirely unthreatening. Holmes knocked. Mrs. Alderton answered the door herself, which suggested she had seen them coming. The cottage windows faced the lane, and a person who had been watchful for the last 3 days would have been at a window. She was a woman of perhaps 55, well-made and composed, with grey-streaked hair arranged neatly, and a black dress that was correct for mourning without being excessive about it. Her face, when she opened the door and found Holmes and Watson and Miss Marple on her step, did precisely what Miss Marple had said it would do. It stayed calm. Not the calm of someone pleasantly surprised, or the calm of someone unsurprised, or even the careful calm of someone managing a reaction. It was a deeper stillness than any of those. The calm of someone who had been expecting this moment for 3 days and had decided, at some point in those 3 days, exactly how they would meet it. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I thought you might come." "Then you've saved us both some time," Holmes said pleasantly. "May we come in?" The parlour was as neat as the exterior promised. A fire already burning. She had known they were coming then, or had kept the fire going all morning in readiness, which amounted to the same thing. 2 chairs facing the hearth, a small settee, a side table with a vase of dried flowers. On the mantelpiece, a photograph of a man Watson took to be the late Gerald Oakes, square-faced, solid, with the expression of a man who took his responsibilities seriously and expected the same of others. Beside it, a smaller photograph of a couple Watson did not recognize, which he presumed was the brief second marriage. Mrs. Alderton sat in one of the chairs by the fire, with the composure of a woman in her own home, receiving guests she has invited, rather than investigators she has not. Holmes took the settee. Watson stood near the window, where he could observe her face in the light. Miss Marple settled into the second chair with the naturalness of someone who simply needed somewhere to sit, and produced her knitting with an air of complete social innocence. "I'd like to begin with Gerald," Holmes said. Something moved in Mrs. Alderton's face. Briefly, not grief, not quite, but the memory of grief, or the memory of something that had complicated grief. "My first husband." "Your first husband discovered that Reverend Hollis had been making private withdrawals from the Roof Restoration Fund. He kept a record, a private accounting, unsigned. He died in April before he had determined what to do with it." Holmes paused. Or perhaps he had determined what to do with it, and had done it, and the Reverend's response to whatever Gerald Oakes said or threatened had contributed in some way to the circumstances of his death. The room received this carefully. Mrs. Alderton's hands, folded in her lap, did not move. "Gerald died of influenza." "Yes, I am not suggesting otherwise." Holmes's voice remained even, conversational, almost gentle, the voice of a man having a reasonable discussion. "I am suggesting that the months before he died were not easy ones, that there was a conversation between him and the Reverend that did not resolve itself, that he died carrying something that did not die with him, because he had given the accounting sheet to someone for safekeeping before his health failed." "He gave it to you," Watson said quietly from the window. Mrs. Alderton looked at Watson. Her eyes were steady and dark and told him nothing, which itself told him something. "He gave it to me," she said at last, "in March. when it was clear he was not recovering. He said that Hollis had taken money that the parish trusted him with, and that someone should know, and that he was sorry he had not managed to do more about it himself. She paused. Gerald was a man who believed that things should be right. He found it very difficult when they weren't. And after he died, Holmes said, you married Mr. Alderton. In June. He was a kind man, and I needed. She stopped, began again, more evenly. He died in September. A stroke. I was unlucky in my husband's, Mr. Holmes. You needn't make more of that than it is. I make nothing of it, Holmes said with complete honesty. It is relevant only in that it explains the name change, and the slight delay in my tracing the connection between yourself and Gerald Oakes. Silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the lane was empty and white with frost, the village sealed in its quiet winter morning. Miss Marple's needles moved with their gentle, rhythmic authority. You came back to Chadwick Fen, Holmes continued, after Mr. Alderton's death. You had the accounting sheet, you had Gerald's knowledge, and you had, by that point, something else. A letter that you had intercepted before the vicar could read it, which told you that Clara Hollis had found the discrepancy in the accounts, which meant that the matter you had been deciding how to handle for 6 months had acquired a timeline. Mrs. Alderton looked at the fire. You read Clara's letter, Watson said. He kept his voice level, non-accusatory, the doctor's voice, the voice that had extracted difficult truths from difficult people for 30 years, by making truth-telling feel less like exposure and more like relief. You came to the vicarage the day before the Thursday tea, while Clara was at the church and Mrs. Peel was in the kitchen, and you went into the study, and you read it, and you understood that if Clara was asking questions, the vicar would eventually have to account for himself, publicly, formally, in a way that would include Gerald's name, Gerald's discovery, the record that Gerald had kept and died holding. And that, Holmes said very quietly, was when you decided that waiting was finished. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. The fire settled into itself with a sound like a slow, releasing breath. Miss Marple did not look up from her knitting. Watson watched Mrs. Alderton's face and saw in it the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight at great effort for a long time and has arrived at a moment where the effort is no longer required. Because the thing is done, or because the thing has been found out, and in some deep, unreachable part of a person, these two outcomes produce the same physical sensation. He let Gerald die thinking he had failed, she said. Her voice was completely steady. Gerald spent his last weeks believing that he had not done enough, that he had found the dishonesty and confronted it, and been managed, accommodated, invited to Thursday tea as though he were a minor inconvenience, rather than a man trying to do right by his parish. She looked at Holmes directly, for the first time since they had sat down. Hollis told him he had misread the accounts, that the money would be reconciled in the new year. He told him this kindly, calmly, with the full authority of a man of God, speaking to a man who still, despite everything, found it difficult to believe that a vicar would lie to him. And Gerald believed him, Watson said. Gerald wanted to believe him, which is not the same thing, but felt enough like it to keep him quiet. Her hands moved, slightly, not a gesture, just a shift, as though something that had been rigid had minutely relaxed. He died in April. In May I found the accounting sheet among his papers. In June, I married James Alderton because he was kind, and I was not thinking clearly. In September he died, and I came back here, and I sat with what Gerald had left me, and I thought about what a man of Gerald's character deserved, which was not to have the person who had dismissed and outlasted him continue to conduct Thursday teas and deliver sermons about honesty for the next 20 years. The room was entirely still. Holmes looked at her for a long moment. His expression held no triumph, no satisfaction of the performance kind, only the sober attention of a man who has followed a thread to its source and found, at the source, not a monster, but a person. "The monk's hood," he said. "Where did you obtain it?" "My own garden, in St. Mary Mead, before I left. I have grown it for years. It is common enough, and I knew what it was. I have always known what it was." A pause. "I had read, years ago, about the alkaloid, about how small a quantity was required, about how it presented." Her voice did not waver, but there was something underneath it now, not remorse, not yet, but a kind of hollow quality, as though she was hearing herself from a slight distance. "I did not decide quickly. I thought about it for 2 months. I thought about whether I was certain. I thought about Gerald." "And the teaspoon," Holmes said. The drawing-room was empty. Mrs. Peel had set the table the previous evening. She always does. I knew which place was his. I had attended enough. Thursday teas to know exactly where he sat, which cup, which spoon. She looked at her own hands. It took less than a minute. I had thought it would feel larger, somehow. It didn't. Watson stepped outside while Constable Briggs was sent for. He stood in the cottage garden in the cold morning air, breathing slowly, looking at the lane and the frost and the bare hedgerow and the distant church tower with its permanent slight lean toward the east. He thought about Gerald Oakes, who had spent his last weeks believing he had failed a trust, who had died with that belief intact because the man he had trusted had been too composed to let the truth reach him. He thought about a 6-month interval between that death and this one, in which a woman had sat with a private accounting sheet and a deepening conviction, and had eventually arrived at a decision that had taken less than a minute to execute in an empty drawing-room. He thought about the teaspoon, the small silver thing, placed, with a left-handed instinct on the wrong side of a saucer, straightened by Clara's unknowing hand, repositioned again by Mrs. Alderton's watchful one. Handled 4 times in 24 hours, each handling a different chapter of the same quiet story. He heard the cottage door open behind him. Miss Marple came out and stood beside him, and they were both quiet for a moment, looking at the lane. "You knew," Watson said, "before Holmes did." "I knew who," Miss Marple said. "Holmes knew how. They are different kinds of knowing, and both were necessary." She looked at the church tower. In a village, you learn to read people over years, the small daily performances, the way someone's face moves when a particular subject arises, the specific quality of a calm that is chosen rather than natural. I have watched a great many people in difficult situations, Dr. Watson, and I have found that the ones who are truly composed in moments of crisis are either very good people or very decided. Once, she paused. Mrs. Alderton is not a good person, but she was, a decided one. Is there a difference in law? In law, no? Miss Marple picked up her knitting bag from the step where she had left it. In understanding, perhaps. I find I cannot entirely withhold understanding, even when I cannot withhold judgment. Gerald Oakes was a decent man who was deceived and dismissed, and died believing himself to have failed. That is a genuine wrong. It simply required a different remedy than the one she chose. Constable Briggs arrived at the lane's end, moving with the careful urgency of a man who has understood that something significant has happened and is not entirely sure how to look equal to it. Watson watched him come, the village constable, the frost-white lane, the church in the distance, the whole small-scale machinery of English justice arriving on foot in a December morning to collect one decided woman from her own neat parlour. He thought, Holmes was right. The smallness was the strategy. And the smallness, in the end, was what undid it, because small things left small evidence, and small evidence, examined with sufficient patience, told the whole story. He went back inside. The arrest, such as it was, had none of the drama that Watson had learned over years of chronicling Holmes's cases to half expect at such moments. There was no flight, no denial beyond what had already been offered, no scene of the kind that made for satisfying final paragraphs. Mrs. Alderton put on her coat, the good black wool one, the morning coat, which Watson thought she wore with a kind of bleak appropriateness, picked up her handbag with the neat precision of a woman who does not leave houses untidily, and walked out to Constable Briggs's custody with the composure that had characterized her throughout. At the gate she paused, briefly, and looked back at the cottage. Watson couldn't see her face from where he stood. He did not try to. Then she walked away down the frost-white lane, and the cottage door was closed, and Chadwick Fen went about its morning with the slightly heightened quality of attention that a village gives to significant events, not intrusively, not openly, but with the collective awareness of a community that has understood something has shifted, even if the precise nature of the shift will take some days to fully circulate. Holmes stood at the vicarage gate for a long time after. Watson found him there an hour later, when the practical matters had been attended to, and Briggs had telephoned the county police, and the machinery of formal proceedings had been set quietly into motion. Holmes was looking at the garden, the bare rose canes, the frost-stiffened lawn, the flagstone path to the church, with the expression he wore at the ends of cases, which was not satisfaction and not relief, but something more complicated than either, a kind of settling, the interior architecture completing itself, the last stone placed, the structure standing. The ribbon, Watson said. Holmes looked at him. I should return it to the rose cane, Watson said. It was hers, Mrs. Alderton's, but it was tied around the Reverend's rose, and it seems wrong to keep it. He paused. And it seems wrong to simply discard it. Holmes considered this for a moment, with the seriousness he gave to questions that appeared small and were not. Leave it, he said. Mrs. Peel will find it eventually, or the garden will reclaim it. Either way it will resolve itself more gracefully than we could manage. Watson put the ribbon back in his coat pocket and said nothing further. The church clock struck 11. Its note fell into the cold air and disappeared, and the churchyard was very still, and the thin winter sun was doing what it could with the frost, which was not much, but was sufficient. Miss Marple had arranged tea, not at the Wheatsheaf and not at the vicarage, which felt, for the immediate present, like a house that needed to be left alone with itself for a while. She had arranged it with the quiet organizational competence that Watson was coming to recognize as one of her primary characteristics. At the small parlour of Mrs. Peel's private rooms at the back of the vicarage, where Mrs. Peel herself sat in the corner with a cup she kept forgetting to drink, and the expression of a woman reassembling her understanding of the past 11 years, one piece at a time. The tea was very good. Someone, presumably Miss Marple, had also produced a fruitcake of the dense, serious Christmas variety, the kind that had been made in October and fed brandy at intervals, and was now at the peak of its authority. Watson ate 2 slices and felt measurably better about the world. Holmes ate nothing, which was normal, and sat in the chair nearest the window, which looked out on the kitchen garden, the practical side of the vicarage, the vegetable beds put to sleep under straw, the cold frames, A's, row of terracotta pots stacked against the wall, the working part of the house. He looked at it with the unfocused attention of a man whose mind has moved beyond the immediate problem, and not yet settled on the next one, which Watson recognized as the closest Holmes came to rest. Miss Marple poured tea with the easy authority of a woman who has poured tea in many difficult situations, and found it consistently useful, and set a cup at Holmes's elbow without comment. He drank it, which Watson noted with quiet satisfaction. "I owe you a candour," Holmes said to Miss Marple after a while. She looked at him over her own cup with polite attention. "I wouldn't have placed Mrs. Alderton as quickly without your observation about the face," he said. "I had the mechanism, the teaspoon, the clock, the gate, the letter, the accounting sheet. The mechanism pointed at her clearly enough, but the mechanism alone might have taken another day to become a conversation, and in that day she might have managed things differently." He paused. "Your observation about the quality of her calm and what distinguished it from natural composure shortened the distance considerably." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the careful honesty of someone who does not accept compliments she has not fully earned, "And I would not have known about the mechanism without you. I knew she had done it before I could have told you how. There was no path from my knowing to any useful conclusion without your how." She set down her cup. "I find that rather a satisfying division of labour on reflection." Holmes looked at her with the expression Watson had first noticed in the vicarage drawing-room, that quality of genuine attention given to something that had surprised him. "As do I," he said, and meant it completely. Watson wrote nothing in his notebook. Some things were better kept as they were, uncatalogued, existing only in the room where they had occurred. He simply sat, with his second cup of tea and the last of the fruitcake, and let the moment be what it was. They left Chadwick Fen on the 4 o'clock train. Clara Hollis came to the station to see them off, pale still and quieter than she had probably been before any of this, but with a steadiness about her that suggested she was the kind of person who found their footing eventually, and had begun to find it. She shook Watson's hand with both of hers, and thanked him with the simple directness of someone who meant it, and did not know how else to say so. She shook Holmes's hand once, briefly, and looked at him with the slightly searching expression of someone trying to locate, in a face that habitually concealed things, some evidence of what he actually thought. Holmes, for once, offered something close to legibility. "Your letter was the right thing to do," he said. "The circumstances surrounding it were not your fault." Clara nodded once and looked away, and Watson suspected she might cry after they had gone, and that this was entirely appropriate and would do her good. Miss Marple was not at the station. She had said her goodbyes at the vicarage parlour, with the practical warmth of a woman who does not extend farewells unnecessarily, and had mentioned, as a final, understated piece of information, that she would be staying another few days in Chadwick Fen, as Mrs. Peel needed company, and as there were 1 or 2 threads in the village, she felt it was her responsibility to see properly settled before she returned to St. Mary Mead. Holmes had listened to this and said nothing. But on the station platform, waiting for the train, he stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked down the lane toward the village. And Watson saw him smile, not the sharp, brief smile of a solved puzzle, but something slower and less defined, the smile of a man who has encountered something he respects. The train arrived with the comfortable noise of trains in winter, the hiss and clank of it, the warm gust of displaced air, the particular smell of coal smoke and iron and heated compartments that Watson associated with departure, and the specific pleasure of motion after stillness. They found a compartment to themselves. Holmes took the window seat, which he always did, and which Watson always permitted, because the window was where Holmes did his best idle thinking, and idle thinking was the closest thing to rest that Holmes reliably achieved. The train moved. Chadwick Fen retreated. The station, the church tower, with its permanent eastern lean, the frost-white fields beginning to blue in the early dark, the hedgerows passing in their bare winter rows. Watson watched it go with the feeling he always had at the end of a case in the country, a compound of relief and a slight, honest melancholy, as though something had been concluded that could not be unconcluded, which was simply the truth of all conclusions. He took out his notebook, looked at the last page, teaspoon, left side, wrong. He looked at it for a moment. Then he wrote beneath it, slowly. The small things are never small. The world arranges its evidence not in grand gestures, but in quiet ones, in a spoon placed without thinking, a clock stopped with precision, a ribbon tied in a garden at dusk. The mystery was not in the darkness of the act, but in its patience, in the long, quiet distance between a grief and its resolution, in the particular human capacity to wait. He paused, added, Holmes would call this sentimental. He would be right. I record it anyway. He closed the notebook. Holmes was asleep before they reached the county boundary. Not the deliberate managed rest of a man applying himself to recovery, but the genuine, unguarded sleep of someone whose mind had finally, briefly, set down its work. He sat with his head resting against the window frame, his coat collar turned up against the chill of the glass, the frost-blue countryside moving silently. Behind him, in the fading light, Watson looked at him for a moment. The angular face relaxed for once, the habitual tension of observation gone, the lines of him softened by the extraordinary democratic equalizer of simply being tired, and felt the particular fondness of long familiarity, the feeling of knowing someone across the full range of what they were, the difficult parts and the rare parts and the parts that only showed themselves in unguarded compartments on winter trains, and finding the total of it, without sentimentality, without illusion, worth keeping company with. The train moved through the dark. The fields gave way by degrees to the edges of towns, to the scattered lights of suburbs, to the gradual thickening of the world that meant London was assembling itself in the distance. The frost was softer here. The city generated its own warmth, its own particular climate of coal smoke and human density, and the deep radiating heat of 1,000,000 lives conducted in proximity. Watson looked out at it coming and thought about Chadwick Fen, the church clock, the frosted churchyard, Miss Marple at the window of the vicarage drawing-room, the red ribbon tied to a rose cane in a winter garden by a hand that had decided something and marked it, in the small private way of people who have no one to confirm their plans with, and so confirm them to themselves. He thought about Gerald Oakes, who had died believing he had not done enough. He thought about Mrs. Alderton, walking down the frost-white lane in her morning coat, with her handbag held correctly and her face still composed, and the years of patient, solitary decision that the composure covered. He thought about a teaspoon on the wrong side of a saucer, in a quiet drawing-room, in a village so small that its tragedies wore the costume of the ordinary, and were visible only to those who had learned, through long practice, through the disciplined cultivation of attention, to look at small things as though they mattered, because they did. They always did. The train ran on. Holmes slept. London rose in its winter darkness ahead of them, the gas lamps and the fog and the great, indifferent, endlessly generative noise of it. And Watson sat with his closed notebook in his lap, and the comfortable weight of a case concluded settling over him like a blanket, like the dark outside the window, like the rhythm of the train on its tracks, steady and even and carrying them home. And that concludes our story for tonight, Sherlock Holmes and the vicarage poisoning. If you found your way to sleep somewhere in these pages, I hope it was a peaceful one. If you're still here, still listening, hello, quietly. Thank you for the company. Tell me where you listened from, if you'd like. I read every note. Sleep well, wherever you are.